Well, good evening, everybody. So very excited to be with you tonight and to be starting off in our study of the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers. I actually have feedback right here that I'm going to have to fix for just a second. Sometimes if I don't forget to pause my YouTube feed, it'll play a few seconds later. And, you know, if you leave it running long enough, it just keeps looping itself over and over again until you really feel like you're losing your mind. So you got to be careful with something like that. So sorry about that. So let's get our Bibles out and let's go over to the book of Numbers. And we're going to be talking tonight about this marvelous book, a book presumed to have been written by Moses. It's usually referred to as one of the 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Moses is assumed to be the author of those books, and I say that kind of carefully because they do record several things that suggest Moses wasn't the only author. Perhaps Joshua was also one of the people that helped to write that book as well. So as we talk about the book of Numbers, a couple of things to think about. First and foremost, why is it called the book of Numbers? It's kind of interesting. The books of the Old Testament, Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, with the exception of Numbers, they're all Greek names, and they kind of reflect the time when the Septuagint was the popular Old Testament version. That's in the time of Christ, by the way, not like the 1950s or something like that. So those other names are in Greek, and this book used to have a Greek name as well, and yet we now know it as the book of Numbers. And we call it the book of Numbers because it begins and ends with a lot of numbers. Specifically, the census of the people of Israel. And this is kind of important. Numbers is really interesting because Numbers is all about the wandering in the wilderness. It's a history book. It's a law book. It covers a lot of laws of God, but at the same time, it's also the idea of a lot of the things that the Israelites are going to go through. This is an important book to understand the idea. Now, Rob makes a comment to say that, well, the Hebrew language is what the book of Numbers was written in. And that's right. Rob's right. It was written in the Hebrew language. It was translated just before Jesus' time into Greek. And since most people were reading Greek at that time, that's why many of the New Testament writers quoted the Greek translation of the Bible. So that's a good observation, Rob. Debbie Root makes the point to say the reason it's called Numbers, it's the numbering of the people of Israel. And that's exactly right. It's the majority of their wandering time, too, about 38 years in total, give or take a little bit. We'll start off at the beginning of the second year, and we'll end more or less right before the final giving of the law and Moses dying. So these are things that are important for us to understand and learn about. Now, why is the book of Numbers an important book? Of course, you know, it's not like we really say any book of the Bible is not important. But the book of Numbers has a great multitude of references in the New Testament. There's a lot of people and events that are mentioned in the book of Numbers that New Testament writers expect us to have a knowledge of. We're going to meet people in the book of Numbers, people that we haven't met before, and they're going to be people that are going to be spoken of in the New Testament, people that the New Testament writers are going to say, hey, remember, for example, a guy named Korah or Balak or Balaam. These are all people we're going to learn about. Remember what happened to the children of Israel at Baal Peor. 1 Corinthians 10 is going to say, and we need to know that event, which is recorded here. Jesus is going to talk about the bronze serpent. He's going to say, remember the bronze serpent. Well, that's in the book of Numbers. It's really fascinating. In fact, every class, I kind of hope we get a few minutes of time to say, there's something really important about the book of Numbers to the Christian life. So this is one of those times where we're studying the Old Testament, and yet the Old Testament's going to have a tremendous importance to our covenant of Christ today. So that's something I'm looking forward to us covering and us discussing. So when we started reading the book of Numbers, I hope you were able to read through chapters 1 through 6. That's going to be about the longest reading you're going to have in our assigned readings. They'll get shorter till a few of them are just going to be one chapter of reading. I wanted us to cover all 6 chapters, in part because as you were enumerating Israel, those are things that I want to move through kind of rapidly to start off with the idea that Israel is being numbered. And there's something important to notice here, especially when you kind of consider the idea of the history of the people of Israel. As you're reading through in Numbers chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're reading about Israel being counted out. And the point is, Israel reflects the idea that God has tremendously blessed this group of people. We know that at the end of Genesis, they entered Egypt with 66 people, actually 66 direct descendants, the Bible says, of the man Jacob. Now, when they leave Egypt, they're going to leave with 600,000 plus, or 600,000 men that are going to be counted in that count. So maybe double or triple that number, in fact. So we see that they've grown tremendously. And this is, of course, part of the blessing that God had made, a promise God had made to Abraham, that he was going to have a multitude of descendants. Now, by the way, we're actually the real descendants of Abraham. The Bible in the New Testament repeatedly says we're the descendants of faith of Abraham. And so when those promises were made, while Israel literally fulfills that, we also are part of that too. So that's something that we want to know and want to understand about. So we see here an enumeration, a counting out of all the people of Israel. Going to have a couple of questions here in a moment to kind of set that off. The first one's going to be, why were the Levites not numbered? And in just a few moments, we're going to be asking that question. Now, it also describes how it was that they were laid out in their camp. And there's a lot of different illustrations I've seen about this. Stephen James was just sharing one of the illustrations. It kind of looks like a T or a plus symbol. Some people kind of draw it more like this so that everybody was surrounded around the camp. So the idea was the center of their camp was the tabernacle. At the heart of their identity, at the very middle of these things, was God. So that the Word of God describes the idea that there was a cloud of fire and a pillar of smoke. And all the Israelites were camped around that, and they could see those things. It would have been really something marvelous to consider. Now, when you think about this, the idea of that great mass of people, remember, this is a camp of 2 million people, perhaps. Well, how big is Portland? Portland's what, 3 million in the metro area? Point is, it's enormous. It's just this gigantic camp. We probably really can't get a good feel for just how big this was. All the logistics of sanitation, or, we know water consumption is a big issue a lot. That's a conversation they have. Food, fortunately, is something that was taken care of in a rather simplistic way. And it's really neat that we have that description of how that was accomplished. We talked about that back in Exodus. We're going to talk a lot about manna, by the way, in the book of Numbers. Manna comes up a few times. And so it's something we want to know about. Next week, I think we're going to touch on that a little bit. But the whole point is God arranges them out. If you're trying to find some of the order of these things, it's kind of hard sometimes to get a sense of this, except to say that these seem to be characterized, their camps seem to be characterized by the mothers of the sons. So there were 4 women that were the mothers of the children of Israel. And perhaps it seems that in some ways these camps are in some ways split a little bit like that. Of course, there's that isn't exactly true with Levi being in the middle and such. But there does seem to be some of that kind of grouping like that. Just kind of something worth paying attention to or worth looking at. So our first question was this. As we were looking through all the enumeration of these people and of the children of Israel, the first question was, why is it that God did not number the Levites? And then, of course, here's the great irony. They are numbered. They are going to be counted. But that kind of tells us something about the nature of what's being counted or why they're counting them. So the question is, why were the Levites not numbered? Well, Stan has one answer. Stan makes the statement, the Levites were set apart for service. So one of the important ideas that we're going to be talking about tonight is the setting apart of the Levites for service. Now, Lamar makes this statement. Lamar points to Numbers chapter 2, verses 32 and 33. It says the reason for the counting related to arms of forces. So he makes the observation, Levites weren't counted as they were exempt from service. Now, that's important, by the way, Lamar, because that is the idea of the census purpose. And by the way, that's also the census in the time of David, that it's a census of the army, and it was contrary to God's will to trust in those things. But here is a census that seems to be counting fighting men. So Lamar observes the idea that it's the case that they weren't counted in that sense too. Debbie makes the point too. Again, going to the same passage that Lamar does, they were not fighting men. Rob points to the idea, again, they belong to the Lord for the service to the tabernacle, so no wrath falls on them. By the way, Rob, that's going to be an important idea. The idea that the idea of the wrath of God on the Levites, that's really kind of something interesting. We're not going to get into tonight, but we're going to talk about this one because I think it's just a fascinating thing to consider. Grant makes the statement, conquering Canaan was not the job of the Levites. They were to serve the tabernacle. Teresa says they wouldn't be going to war. They'd serve God and the people. Because God had said, only the tribe of Israel you shall not number, nor take census of them among the children of Israel. George, I like your answer because more or less I think the right answer could have been because God said not to. Now, a little further on, you might notice that in chapter 26, it says the Levites weren't numbered. Here's another reason to consider. Because there was no inheritance given to them among the children of Israel. Now think about this for a second, too. Later on, there's going to be a census again. And as they enumerate the people, one of the ideas of these enumerations is the idea of how they're going to be given their land as well. So there's some sense of that, too. But basically, in this early part, what we're looking at is a concept where they're not being numbered, and the Bible, more or less in chapter 2 tells us why. As it talks about these things, they're not going to be numbered, and part of that seems to be tied, as Lamar and several of you pointed out, to the military aspects of these things, and some of it seems to be tied also to the idea of their particular and unique service. And of course, as it's stated here too, or as George stated, God said not to do it, and later we're told too that part of this was that they didn't receive an inheritance, so their enumeration wasn't in the same circumstance. So all these are great answers, right? And it's important to understand that they weren't going to be counted because they're going to be set apart. They're going to be something special, something I think is kind of interesting. I hope you got a chance to read the article I put on Facebook. I know not everybody's on Facebook, so it's not always fair to stick an article on there. But there was a professor of mathematics who had talked about the different numbers, and he charted them out, and very, very much reminded me of, some of my trigonometry classes that I didn't like in high school. But he kind of plotted and graphed different aspects of the numeration. I thought it was interesting. One of the things he pointed out, though, was the idea that by the end of the census, not this census, by the way, so don't get confused, Levi and Simeon are going to enumerate roughly the same. And he saw this as a fulfillment of a prophetic promise of the brotherhood of Levi and Simeon. And that was kind of interesting. Anthony makes the statement, Deuteronomy 10 verses 8 and 9 is another passage about the Levites not having an inheritance in the land. So this is going to be something important and something understood, that the Levites aren't going to receive land the same way. And I say the same way. They're not going to have an inheritance of the land. They're going to inherit cities, but not the inheritance of the land like everyone else. Stan, in fact, goes on to make a point about that. We're going to read about this at the end of Numbers as we talk about the cities of refuge. So the Levites are going to get that, but as the Bible says here, no inheritance is going to be given to them as far as the land inheritance that they receive. So these are all important points for us to consider. So as you look through that list of different things, what tribe was the largest? What was the largest tribe? Hopefully this wasn't too complicated. First time I looked, I misread it too, trying to figure it out myself. Again, though, this is going to kind of be something interesting when we enumerate the tribes at the end, and there's some changes there. But Linda grabs it right off the top. Oh, Rob did too. Judah. Judah is the largest of the tribes. I find that interesting. The preeminence of Judah many different times. Judah is the largest tribe, but as I said, it's going to change. They're going to change who the largest tribe is later on. So that's right. Teresa's got it down to Judah. Boy, I just love it when we all throw those answers like this. I appreciate that. So we're told in the scriptures that those who were numbered of the tribe of Judah were 74,600 men. And again, this is men, specifically as Rob points out, of a certain age. Here's something interesting. Interesting to note that the census total count is estimated close to 2 million people, which God led and provided for in the wilderness for about 40 years. That was my estimation, Lamar, as I kind of just established the idea that, 2.5 times that number would be right. And again, like you said, Lamar, it really is incredible logistically how that gets accomplished. And again, it makes you realize something like when water comes from a rock, for enough water to satisfy the needs of 2 million people plus all their livestock and things like that, it wasn't just a trickle or a stream coming from that rock. It was like the Willamette. I mean, it was enormous. It was a river that poured out of that rock. And that's really kind of a, if you could go back in time and see something, boy, I'd really like to have seen that moment when that rock, back in Exodus 17 originally, and we're going to read about it again in Numbers, but when water came from a rock first at Horeb, I'd love to have seen that moment. And Stan makes a comment about Genesis 49 verses 8 through 10 and Jacob's plan for Judah, and Stan's referring to the idea that the rod or the staff wasn't going to depart from Judah till Shiloh comes. That's a prophecy about Jesus. And Stan, I often wonder if that's a prophecy about the size of Judah or not, and I don't see anything specific about it, but it might be. So, that's worth considering as well. Boy, these are great comments. I appreciate your thoughts. There's a point here where we get a little statement about the priesthood and how this is all going to Aaron and the things like that. And there's a mention made about Aaron's oldest 2 sons. Remind me, in your own words, what happened to them. I tell you what, I'll give you an extra credit, which is worth about as much as you think it is. I'll give you an extra credit if you can tell me why it's significant. Why is significant? What do you think there? What happened to Aaron's oldest sons, and why is that a big deal to us? It's not in the book of Numbers. I mean, it's mentioned, but it's not, the event itself is not recorded in Numbers. It's back in Leviticus chapter 10. What happened with them? So Teresa makes a statement. They were killed by God because they brought in strange fire. They didn't obey God. Teresa, I'll give you that extra credit point that's worth, like I said, about whatever you want it to be worth. Stan points to, they offered strange fire. That's right. Monique gets the extra credit too. It's about authority. Did they do something with God's permission? And the answer is God hadn't said they couldn't, you could say. But the point was that God hadn't said they could. This is a Authority 101 lesson for us. When we consider what happened to these 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, and how it was, Numbers chapter 3 and verse 4 points out, they offered profane fire before the Lord. By the way, anybody know another word for profane? I should have grabbed a different translation to throw that. Give me another word for profane in case somebody is confused. But the idea here, they were killed by God. They offered strange fire. They did not honor God. All of these are important points. And we often point to them and say that when it comes to the authority of God, when God tells us something, we don't add to that. We don't take away from that. We do it as God said. Grant has, Debbie has unauthorized. Debbie Root, I've got 2 Debbies in a row. Boy, that's confusing. Debbie Root says strange. Debbie Watkins says the ESV uses unauthorized. That's the one I love the most. Strange, the term unauthorized is actually the term I think is the best for us because it really tells us the most significant idea. You don't do things without God's authority. And like I said, that's Bible 101. That's Authority 101. Nadab and Abihu are the teachers of that class on the authority of God. You don't do things you don't have authority for. We don't bring unauthorized sacrifices to God. And that's something, like I said, that's true then, and it's true now too. So it's an important point for us to consider and take a few minutes of our time to dwell on and look at. Anybody else throws something out there, I'll grab it, but I think you all knew what was happening there. So let's talk, Gregor's got one more comment. They changed God's plan. Fire was the plan, but it was specific. And that's interesting, Gregor, that the idea was it wasn't fire, but it wasn't the fire that God had stipulated they needed to bring. Teresa sums it up nicely to say when God says do something, everything else is unauthorized. And that's an important point for us to consider. Again, that's an Authority 101 moment. So that's worth our time. Now there's a change mentioned at the end of this part of the reading as it relates to the characteristics of the Levites. And towards the end of chapter 3, there's a statement made about the Levites and a change with what's going on regarding the redemption of the firstborn. Can you tell me, maybe in your own words, or if you just want to grab the passages on it, that's always a great answer too. What is the change that's going on? And this is kind of an interesting idea. I'm going to be honest. I've studied this one several different times, and I still kind of ponder exactly what it is that God's mindset and the change of God's mind has happened. I'll throw you a few thoughts first. But what do you see happening here? What happened in regards to the redemption of the firstborn? Now, God had said way back in early Exodus that the firstborn were to belong to him. The firstborn of the animals belonged to him, and they were to be sacrificed. And the firstborn of the children of Israel belonged to him, and they were to be devoted to his service. So Stan makes a point to say it's interesting from this point on that the priests were not to drink during this time of service. So Stan, I'm not sure, if you were thinking of Leviticus 10 when it talks about drinking, is that kind of what you were thinking? Because in the condemnation of Nadab and Abihu, after that moment, drinking is mentioned. I think maybe that's what you're referring to, Stan. Would that be right? As far as this goes, though, what is the idea that change occurred in regarding to the redemption of the firstborn? Well, Monique says God takes the whole tribe of Levi in place of the firstborn. Stan, I'm gonna jump back to Stan's comment. Stan, I've often wondered. Well, I hate to speculate, Stan, but I've often wondered if that statement about the Levites and drinking, and they were not to drink alcoholic beverage, that part of the reason was that maybe that had something to do with why they thought it was okay. They were in some way not full of critical judgment at that moment. I don't know, Stan. Like I said, I hate to attach too much to that, but it is interesting to note. Sorry, I'm going to go back to Monique's comment. Monique says, God takes the whole tribe of Levi in place of the firstborn. So what's interesting about that is that a lot of times the way we look at what God was setting up in Exodus, and I'm going to be careful to say I'm not sure, but a lot of people would suggest that God had originally established the idea that the firstborn of every group of people of every tribe, were going to be the priests of God, that they would be the ones that served God. And some people suggest that whenever there was the incident with the golden calf and Moses said, "Who stands with me?" and the people of Levi stood with him, that set apart the Levites for service. And that could be the case. As I said, I'm kind of, I think it's a kind of a complicated idea of what God is doing. But we know that God more or less stipulated that the Levites were going to be exchanged for the firstborn. So let me read Rob's comment. Rob Wade says, Levites for the firstborn. The Lord owns all the firstborn, but says the Levites now belong to him, and designated a fee for the firstborn to go to Aaron and the sons for service. Now, Rob, that's important. What you just said, really important, really something to think about here. That one of the things was the firstborn still belonged to God, and they had to be redeemed. Now, remember, in Luke chapter 2, when Jesus was born, they go to the temple and they do that redemption cost. Now, though, as Rob points out, that redemption is going to be paid, and the payment is going to go to Levites. So interestingly enough, to some degree, the firstborn of the children of Israel, excuse me, they're still belonging to God, but now the Levites are the ones called to the particular service. So it's an interesting idea. Some people suggest maybe this was, again, God changing his mind, and it could be, or it could be it was just a very complicated plan. I'm not sure which way I go on that. And to me, it's just a very complicated idea as to whether that was God's purpose from the beginning or God changed, because, as I said, some people see this incident with the golden calf as being the trigger to setting the Levites apart. I think either could be true, but I'm not sure either is an easy answer for that. Stan Malorme says this. Stan says, when God took the tribe of Levi, was it not because the rest of the people were not sanctified and were too sinful? So, Stan, I assume you're also referring to that event in Exodus in regards to the matter of the golden calf. And again, that's what a lot of people speculate. And I think that, as I said, that well could be the answer as to why it was the Levites that were set aside for this particular work. Teresa makes a comment, though. She says it was redemption money, or it was redemption money, a foreshadow of Jesus, our Redeemer and High Priest? Question mark. Good question, Teresa. And certainly the concepts of redemption or being bought back are significant to that end. And you might think of the idea of, the children of God being bought back by Jesus for the things, for God and for to belong to God, that certainly could fit into some of that too. That's an interesting question. Anybody else has a thought on what Teresa said there? That really is kind of an important or a significant idea to think about. I'm going to move on to the law of jealousy. I'd be curious. I wish I could ask and say, give me a show of hands. How many of you ever studied the law of jealousy before that's found in Numbers chapter 5? And tell me if that's not a law that kind of makes, it's one of those things to study that you kind of think, what? Right? Law of jealousy. As you read through there in Numbers chapter 5, what you read was this very strange rule. And I say strange in the sense that it's something that's unlike any other law that Moses would give. So the law of jealousy, as you read through here, and it begins, verse 12, it talks about the idea if any man's wife goes astray, behaves unfaithfully, and this is concealed, that a husband can, if he is provoked with a spirit of jealousy, verse 14 says, that he can bring her to the priest, and this really unusual test is performed. As I said, this is really fascinating. One of the things you're going to notice right away, and maybe your first question is, why can't a woman bring her husband for the same test? And I think there's an answer to this. In fact, I think this is a fascinating law, and it kind of speaks to the wisdom of God. And I'll kind of explain why, but I think probably a lot of you can already see this. But let's kind of talk about this one, right? So the spirit of jealousy comes on a husband. He thinks his wife is cheating on him. So what can he do? Well, he can bring his wife to the priest. They bring an offering. The priest then creates this drink, this bitter drink. Now, it's not a dangerous drink, mind you. It's just bitter. And so this wife then drinks it. And if she has been unfaithful, the Bible kind of describes this sense of a rot is brought before her in some kind of way. Her belly or thighs are described as being afflicted by God. I would suggest you miraculously. I would suggest that that's the implication here. So as I said, there really isn't another law like this where somebody has something, lots of other times, there were judges that were meant to decide issues of matters like this, but this is one that God directly says he's going to get involved in. Now, the question you might have is, well, first and foremost, why not the other way around? Why is it that wives didn't bring these things to it? Well, one of the big issues is going to be children. And one of the big ideas of the Israelites and children, let me stop here. You tell me, why is the identity of your children such an important thing? So in other words, somebody has a child and they say, hey, that kid doesn't look like me. I think my wife's been cheating or something like that. Why is that a big deal? Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth. There's a lot of consideration about Boaz and the children that Ruth would have with him and what's going to happen with them. And what is the idea? Maybe just one or two words that describe the significance here. And Anthony said the word I wanted, inheritance. Inheritance. So the idea is that the inheritance can be thwarted. If you were of the tribe of Judah and you were supposed to be in the inheritance of Judah, but you don't think your children are actually your children, that they may not be able to inherit that land. Now, why is it not the other way around? Well, because a woman knows who children hers are. A guy might say, I don't think those are my kids, but no woman says, I don't think those are my kids. A lot of women have wanted to say, I don't think those are my kids, but it's kind of a different thing biologically. At least so my mother tells me. So the point is that it really speaks to the idea of the inheritance and the heritage of children. You guys got it. Teresa says, inheritance laws, especially property and their seed. So one of the issues is that this was a matter too of inheritance. Now, in this matter uniquely, as opposed to any other accusation somebody could make, God acted directly. God acted directly. Now, I guess the way I would think of this, like I said, this was really a pretty marvelous law. Now, I'm gonna ask a question here, and I think Stan may have already given us one of his thoughts on this. The question is this: why is this such a fantastic law? Or why is this, and I'm going to lead you in a question. If we were in court, I'd be accused of leading the witness, because this is a leading question. Why is this law important in protecting wives in Israel? I think this is a fantastic law. I think this is one of those times where God's law was really great, because God said, I'm going to directly get involved on certain things, and marriage is one of them. Now, Stan makes a statement. Stan says, well, for one thing, the fear of showing you were guilty might be enough. Now, Stan, you said something really neat. One of the things I've always found interesting are something called trial by ordeal. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what Stan said. Now, by the way, Stan, I don't think this is the full answer. I think maybe some other people might get it, but I'm going to come back to this in a second. But there was something in times past called a trial of ordeal. I know you've probably heard of them, and typically when you hear about them, you think that trial of ordeal, that's a terrible thing. You know, you throw someone in the water. If they sink, they're innocent. If they float, they're guilty. You think that's a terrible way. Well, that was actually not really what most trial of ordeal were. So the most typical trial of ordeal was this isn't the Bible, by the way. I don't mean to make it. I just want to use this as an example. The trial of ordeal, say, in Europe was, in the Middle Ages, they would heat up a bar of iron. And if somebody was accused of doing something illegal or something like that, they would say, well, trial of ordeal means you can come over, you can grab the bar, and if you are unburned, you're innocent. Now, first you're thinking, that's a terrible idea. But you know what's interesting? The records show that lots of people grabbed the bar, and most of them were unburned. Now, your first thought is, well, miracle? No. What the trial of ordeal offered was an opportunity for a magistrate to put somebody to the test and to give them a weight to say, if you're guilty, you're going to get burned, Ruby. You're going to get hurt. And that's something that, only God would know, they might think. So the idea of a trial of ordeal was really, it tested somebody's conscience. If they thought, I don't want to get caught with this, they do it. And so the assumption is throughout history that the magistrates probably never heated the bar, but that sometimes they did. But it offered the magistrate an opportunity to make a choice himself. Well, here's the point. Is that somebody who says, I'm really innocent here, has a way to prove it. But a husband who just doesn't like his wife can't have her put to death for it. And that's a big deal. Teresa grabs this. Teresa says, because God instills the punishment or shows her to be free of guilt. The idea of the law of jealousy, and one of the fascinating things is it talks about the spirit of jealousy coming over a man, and the spirit of jealousy comes over people all the time. And a lot of times it's fraudulent, it's not true, or it's dishonest. A man meets another woman, he likes her better, he wants to get rid of his wife. What does he do? He accuses her of adultery. What's the law of Moses say about adultery? You're put to death. Well, the whole point is, number one, nobody's going to accuse his wife of adultery if it's going to be proven by God that she is an adulteress. He's a liar. But at the same time, the other half of the genius of this law is if a woman did commit adultery, and the man, by the way, remember, he's guilty and he dies. The law said he's to be put to death. He's going to think twice about the fact that there is a divine test that could show she committed adultery. So don't do it. So in some ways, what God is doing here, he's protecting women from the idea that a man might just try to get rid of his wife and have her put to death by the terms of the law. Couldn't happen because of this magnificent law. But secondly, God is saying, the most important thing you've got going on, your wife, your covenant, your marriage. And I personally will intervene in order that that covenant is kept fair. I think this is magnificent. Just phenomenal of God saying, this is how important this is, and nobody's going to falsely accuse on this subject. Rob goes on to say this. Rob says, this miraculous drink, since it showed a result regardless of evidence, created a mindset to behave in such a way as to not bring upon yourself for any reason for jealousy. It creates abstinence. That's right. In other words, you know you're going to get caught, so don't do it. It solidifies the significance of the marriage covenant in the eyes of God from adultery. So Lamar makes a statement. He says, this law of jealousy would protect the innocent wife falsely accused, as it would clearly convict the guilty wife, since it was before God and the priest. That's it. Lamar, that's the answer, right? This is the way that a woman who was innocent is protected from a false accusation. To this day, right? Isn't this the big thing we talk about all the time? That if an accusation of sexual impropriety is made, that the accusation itself oftentimes has such a weight that it damages somebody's integrity or it damages somebody's persona. What if today you could have a test and say, hey, guess what? We have a test that'll prove whether or not you were whatever the accusation was made against you. Number one, like Rob said, you're not going to want to mess around if you know you could get caught. But number two, no false accusations would be made. If you knew it, they would be proven by God to be false. Rob goes on to say this law of jealousy also creates a sort of nuclear assured destruction mindset if used as a deterrent. So that's a pretty wild way to put it. But yeah. Law of jealousy is a marvelous part of the law of Moses. And I appreciate the fact that all of you saw that too. That really is some great comments. So let's go to the last chapter now, chapter 6, okay? So as we talk about these things, chapter 6 brings us to the Nazarite vow. We've talked about the Nazarite vow a lot. Well, here it is. You just walked into it. Reading chapter 6, you started reading about the Nazarite vow. I find the Nazarite vow absolutely fascinating. We've done sermons on it. And the reason is because we point to the Nazarite vow as being such a profoundly New Testament concept of a dedicating of yourself to God. In fact, that typically is the direction we take with that. So the things we talked about here, the ideas of the Nazarite vow is that, first of all, what you read was it's a choice a person makes. They make a choice to dedicate themselves. The word Nazarite means to separate yourself. Kind of think of the word ecclesia, by the way. That means a separated group of people. That a Nazarite was separated for God for a time, a period. You separate yourself to God by a choice. You make a vow. Man or woman, right? Now, you know what? He can't eat certain things. He can't drink certain things. All these things, they can't touch certain things. And the Bible says in verse 5 that the hair of their head grows and it's holy. It's holy. Now, I've told you before, I've always found it fascinating that nowadays in our science, and I don't use this as an evidence of the Bible, but I think it could be. It's interesting that we know that your hair absorbs all the things that you're consuming. So like if, this is why they take drug tests. If somebody's taking drugs, they can pluck a hair and that toxin is in that hair. So these things you weren't to eat, the idea is that your hair is a manifestation of the things you're abstaining from. So your hair itself becomes a question. Now I got a question here. The question is, Teresa says, it says a man or a woman can take the vow. Then it talks about not cutting their hair. And when the time is over, they cut their, shave their head. Would this be for both man and woman? So I think so, Teresa. I think a man or a woman would either cut their hair the same way. I'm not sure. It does say shave head in verse 9. So I don't think we could say a woman might not shave her head. I think maybe she would. At least as far as the text goes, there doesn't seem to be a distinction. So, Teresa, you say that, and it is kind of interesting to think, well, what could that mean? Paul would talk about a woman with a shorn head as a sign of shame. But, that's not entirely always the case. And perhaps here is a moment where it's not. Just as long hair on a man here wouldn't have been a sign of shame either. So, Teresa, that's a really good question. Anybody else has a comment about that? I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what that's like or what that means. Quick question. Who are the two or three? And Teresa says, I guess she's wearing a covering. It might not matter. And Debbie makes that statement too. Like, women would have worn veils. So I had wondered about that. I wondered if a woman wearing a head covering, it wouldn't have mattered. I don't know. That really is interesting to me. And again, it might even fall into what Paul was trying to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about women wearing head coverings and their hair is their covering. Well, if they didn't have hair, if they'd shaved it off like this, would they have worn the covering? Really interesting. Real interesting. I kind of wonder about this. Stan says some cultures today shave the heads of female children. So interesting point to consider about that. Quick question. Who are the people that we tend to point to as lifelong Nazarites? People who either some or all the aspects of these vows were applied to them all of their lives. Who are the people that we look at? Remind me of those people. Just tell me who they are if you can remember the 2 or 3 people that we speak about, and we typically say these people were Nazarites their entire lives. Remind me who that was. Teresa's got one of them, Samson. Monique says John the Baptist. He's also one we identify like that. The third one's a little trickier, maybe. Actually, I think John the Baptist is a trickier one. Samson. Anthony's got Samson. So John the Baptist, Samson. Who's the third one? It's kind of interesting. Stephen James once pointed out to me that his name, the name of the third one, kind of sounds like the name of Samson, doesn't it? Stephen James says the Rechabites. Interesting. No, that's not the case, but Rechabites are interesting, aren't they? That they have a vow. Stan suggests Hannah. Close, Stan. Not Hannah, but whom? Who was it? Has a name like... and Hannah was given the directions just like Manoah's wife was given the directions. So you got to know it now, right? It is, Teresa's got it, Samuel. Samuel was the third one. So Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist are people that we look at. And I'll say carefully, the Bible never uses the term lifelong Nazarite, but they were given aspects of the vow that they held their entire lives. So those 3 are in. Now you say Anna, but like I said, there's nothing about Anna's life that makes us think that. The only indication for these 3 is that they are told things specific, like don't cut their hair, they can't have grapes, they can't do things like that, drink certain things. Those are conversations that they are told about. Actually, about the mothers of these children are told. Interestingly enough, all 3 of them, their mothers are told these things. So kind of a neat thing to consider. You might think of some others. Like I said, like mentioning the Rechabites is interesting. Hannah or Anna are both interesting people to consider too. But like I said, these 3, Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, their mothers were particularly instructed of who they would be and that they couldn't do certain things. So we see them as being typifying this. So a couple questions about these guys. Question number 1 is this. The Nazarite sacrifice that they come in to make includes unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, verse 15 of the chapter. Why is that? I think there's some incredible, really neat symbolism here. Why might that be? And then who else was consecrated by this? And this kind of maybe tells you a little bit more about who the Nazarites were to the people. So number 1, why do you think unleavened bread was a part of the sacrifice? That's not typical, right? That's not a typical sacrifice for things that are given. Now, the other things he brings, the lamb, the drink offering, those are the grain offerings. Those are things that were typically brought in by other things. But the unleavened bread is kind of unusual. Why? What do you think about unleavened bread? Of course, you're thinking of unleavened bread. You think of, well, when we have the Lord's Supper, we partake of unleavened bread. And that's right. Why? What's the significance? I think George has it. George says, since leaven is symbolic of sin, unleavened bread would be symbolic of being clean or without sin. Now, George, as we describe Jesus, we say unleavened bread is a great representation of Jesus because Jesus was without sin. And the New Testament says leavening is like sin. Well, leavening is also going to be like, as George says, contamination. Stan says unleavened. It means without alteration. Or Stan, I'm going to throw the word contamination on top of that. That it's not been touched with these things. It's pure. It's untouched. So Numbers chapter... Rob has a quick question, by the way. So before I get to question number 2. Number 1, I think you guys got it. Why unleavened bread? Because unleavening is a great symbol of something that's contaminated. And the Nazarite had lived his life uncontaminated. Now, Rob's question is Number 6 and verse 12. Number 6 and verse 12 says, he shall consecrate to the Lord the days of his separation, and with a male lamb for the year of his trespass offering. The former days are lost because his separation was defiled. Rob's question is, does a Levite have to start over? And this was if he had done something like he had touched a corpse. Now, Rob, what's interesting is the Bible actually uses the word, so if he touched a corpse, it actually says he sinned in regard to this. So understand this. When a Levite takes this vow, you got to keep it. You can't just take a Levite vow and then quit, because then if you touch the things Nazarite vow. There's too much "ite." Nazarite vow. If a Nazarite takes this vow and then he says, I'm not going to do it, it's a sin, right? So Rob's question is, well, if he touches a body and he brings an offering, does that mean everything he's done up till then didn't count? Yes, that's what he's saying. And let's understand that's how sin works, even for us. If I'm a devout Christian and then I turn away from God, does that mean everything that I've given to God for the years is a meaningless thing? Yeah, I got to start over. Now, the good news is none of that actually counted anyway, in the sense that it's my walk with Christ that's going to justify me. But yeah, that's the nature of sin. So it really is a good point. So the second question is, who else was consecrated before God by the same offerings? And George has the answer. George says Levites who become priests were consecrated with this offering too. So one of the things to consider is that this kind of tells us what the Levites were kind of about. They were kind of like priests. Now remember, it's interesting because in these first couple of chapters, we saw how the firstborn were taken out of the consideration for the priesthood and goes to the Levites. But now we have something offered again. A way that anybody, a man or a woman, can become this type of priest or like a priest and do this through these things. And so I think it's fascinating because oftentimes I've read a lot of commentators that say, well, what is a Nazarite? And they say, well, Nazarite is kind of like the common law priest. He's the guy that could go around. Now, he can't do anything that a priest can do necessarily, but he has a consideration that is similar to that of a priest. He would have a respect that was similar to that of a priest. I don't want to go too far into this. I'm just going to throw this thought out there, but I've often thought it's fascinating that in the New Testament, we have works that are given to the church: elders, deacons, ministers, evangelists, pastors, teachers. But we also have those same things described not as offices, but things that we all do. Look at Titus chapter 2 when it talks about older men and older women. It's the exact same word that he used to describe elders, presbyteros. But in that case, he's just talking about older men and older women accomplishing these things. Looking at Romans chapter 16, and you meet Phoebe, and he says she's a servant of the church. The word there is the same word as deacon. She's not a deacon of the office, but she's doing something. Teachers, things like that. It's kind of neat in the New Testament. We have both the offices that are given to the church, but we also have things that we're all fulfilling for God that sometimes are similar. And I just think it's such a neat thing to meet here in this place, the Nazarite, after God had said, the Levites are going to be my chosen ones. They'll be the ones that serve before me. But then we're given the Nazarite to say anybody of Israel, man or woman, any Israelite, could dedicate themselves to God. It just, how many times can I say I just love the law of God? And I know I've gone past my time. Just a little bit, though. So a couple of last comments here. Debbie says, that's why I thought Anna might have been a Nazarite. She served in the temple. Interesting. It's kind of interesting. If that's the case, Debbie, it makes you wonder about Jephthah's daughter. And, the big debate about whether or not she was either dedicated to the temple or if she was, sacrificed, that bizarre question in the book of Judges. But, if this was something like that, that would be very interesting. And by the way, Anna, like I said, there's no evidence Anna was born a Nazarite, but you could devote, it doesn't say how long you were a Nazarite. I think I've said in the past, I thought it was a year, but it actually doesn't say. So you could say, I'm going to be a Nazarite from now on, I suppose. Honestly, I guess, there really wasn't a distinction of saying how long that would be. So, Debbie, it's interesting because she actually could have been a Nazarite. There's nothing that says she could have been a Nazarite up to that time. So really, really kind of a cool thing. And Rob's last comment, he says, I didn't know until today a man or a woman could become a Nazarite. It is interesting, things we pick up to that sense. So we'll wrap up here. Next week, more interesting things in the book of Numbers. You got some more reading to do. I don't have it in front of me. What is your reading for next week? Let me just check and see really quickly as I pull up my notes. Looks like you need to read Numbers 7 through 10. Numbers chapter 7 through 10. And going to be talking about the moving of the ark and the consecration of the Levites and some of the interesting things we're going to be experiencing there. Again, pointing us to the New Testament. Thanks so much. Great comments, great thoughts tonight. Really appreciate your feedback on things. And God bless you. Have a great week.